While he was trying to win the commission to put the dome on the cathedral in 1419, Brunelleschi was commissioned by the Arte della Seta, the Silk Guild, to begin work on the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Holy Innocents, or orphanage in Florence, which you see now. The Silk Guild was actually the guild to which he belonged in the eclectic way of Florentine guilds by virtue of being a nominal goldsmith, and this in fact caused him considerable trouble throughout his career with the Masons Guild, whose members in short didn't like the idea of a goldsmith getting work as an architect. Nicholas Pevsner calls the Ospedale here the first Renaissance building, and it was this colonnade that Michelozzo imitated when he designed the cloister of San Marco we saw a little while ago. Again, there's nothing here that shows any Gothic influence. It's as though the style had never existed. The precedents for this are Romanesque and, even more clearly, classical Roman architecture itself, especially as it appeared in the early Christian churches like St. Paul outside the walls and Santa Sabina in Rome, which we saw last quarter. The heavy string course lying on top of the arches seems in fact to act like a kind of barrier to keep the eye from looking up. Just the opposite of the intended effect of the Gothic style. This orphanage has been in business for close to 600 years and is usually considered to be the oldest still functioning. 8 columns of people named Innocenti in the Florentine phone book testify to its ongoing service. About 1430, while he was working on the dome, Brunelleschi drew up plans for the Church of Santo Spirito, which, like most of his projects, was not to be completed in his lifetime. Again, what this reminds one of is early Christian churches rather than Gothic ones, much closer to its own time period. The geometrical quality of churches like this and San Lorenzo, which we'll see in a minute, is often emphasized, but the truth is that they're not any more geometrical than the Cathedral of Chartres or Notre Dame. You can go all over Gothic churches with compasses and rulers and so on, and they're certainly geometrical in the fullest sense. It's just that the geometry is different here. As I mentioned when we saw Santa Maria del Carmine, an awful lot of 15th century Tuscan churches don't really have any facade at all, and Santo Spirito is no exception. A few years ago, a sort of tongue-in-cheek contest was held to try to come up with a design. The designs were photographed and then projected life-size onto the bare whitewashed front. This suggestion, submitted by a fashion-conscious designer, was one of the favorites, but like so many other ideas, it remains, alas, unexecuted. It might be better than this, though. This is the facade of the Medici family church of San Lorenzo, for which Brunelleschi drew up the rebuilding plans at some time in the late 1420s, when he was taking a break, I guess, from inspecting the bricks for the cathedral dome. It's across the street from the Medici Palazzo in the heart of the city, but a lot of tourists who don't know what this is, I'm sure, mistake it for some factory and just pass it by. Even Michelangelo couldn't get a plan for the facade of this church accepted, so it's not surprising no other architect since has had any better luck. Inside, it's a different story, of course. In speaking of the geometry of this church, James Burke says that it was made strictly according to the principles of perspective. What's that supposed to mean? He seems to think that because a photograph of this church interior displays one-point perspective, that means there's something unique about the church itself, when in fact a photograph of the church of Notre Dame or Chartres will produce the same result, or a photograph of the Temple of Karnak, for that matter. Again, it's not that Renaissance churches are geometrical and Gothic ones aren't. It's that Renaissance churches are just geometrical in a different way. One odd thing about Renaissance churches is the lack of sculptural decoration, which in part is a function of their frequent lack of any facade at all, But even those with facades, like those by Alberti we'll see eventually, are almost entirely without sculpture. And this is an age famous for its abundant sculptural talent. We go from the Gothic style, in which virtually all the sculpture done was for the decoration of churches, to the Renaissance now, in which hardly any sculpture was done for them. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but not much. Remember that Donatello and Cosimo de' Medici are buried under that slab, that elaborate marble work, and later Medici will be buried in Michelangelo's new sacristy here, which we'll see eventually. But Cosimo's own father, Giovanni da Bicci de' Medici, was buried in the old sacristy, which was also rebuilt by Brunelleschi in the 1420s. You can see the tomb of Giovanni da Bicci de' Medici now in the San Lorenzo old sacristy. Michelangelo's sacristy is, of course, much more famous, but Brunelleschi's here is an important piece of architecture, and Michelangelo was to imitate it in his own project. It has a sail dome created by putting a hemisphere of diameter d on top of a cube of diagonal d. The parts of the hemisphere that overlap the cube are then, as it were, sliced off. Donatello made the historiated bronze doors you can see and the terracotta medallions, but it's said that Brunelleschi didn't like them. This is the Pazzi Chapel next to Santa Croce now, which was apparently designed by Brunelleschi in the early 1430s, and also was left unfinished at his death like so many of his projects. But there has been a flurry of controversy lately about whether or not he was really the architect. Some think it's Michelozzo's work, or maybe even partly the work of a lesser architect named Giuliano da Maiano. But every authority from Vasari to Jansen has given Brunelleschi the credit, and it will take some pretty hard evidence to change this view. In any case, it certainly is one of the real masterpieces of the 15th century.
We're going to flash back here for just a minute to the cathedral dome. After it was finished, a fellow named Baccio d'Agnolo was commissioned to put a decorative grille around the base. But when Michelangelo saw it, he said, "That looks like a cricket cage," and work was immediately stopped and never finished. I think when Michelangelo saw this railing or balustrade, he said, "This looks like a bicycle rack." Work was stopped and it was just left as it is.
Architecture, especially when it's on a relatively small scale like this, sometimes takes on the character of abstract sculpture, and I don't know of any work that better illustrates that than this. This is a closer view of the building. What makes the facade even more like a work of sculpture is that it isn't even really part of the building. It's just a kind of false front. One thing that helps it achieve its effect, too, is the fact that it's made of the cool gray limestone called Pietra Serena, serene stone, that does seem to help create an aura of harmonious serenity. Do you remember the Hadrianic Arch from early last quarter? The single arch that breaks up a facade in the buildings of the late Roman Empire that were put up before the whole arched colonnade became popular? Well, this is one here. This is the interior now, which is very similar to that of the old sacristy at San Lorenzo. The glazed terracotta apostles in the roundels in this chapel between the columns were done by Luca della Robbia, and Brunelleschi himself apparently did the roundels higher up in the spandrels of the dome. Although again, Brunelleschi died long before it was finished. He also laid out the plans for the second or large cloister next to the one in which the Pazzi Chapel's to be found at Santa Croce. And you see that cloister here, it's hardly really distinguishable from Michelozzo's at San Marco, except for the fact that it's larger. This is his death mask now in the Cathedral Museum. Like so many Renaissance artists, he never married, although he adopted his favorite pupil, the third-rate sculptor Andrea Cavalcanti. His funeral was held in the cathedral under the dome which he had built, and his tombstone can still be seen where he was buried, like a pharaoh in his pyramid, one commentator says. And this is his tomb in the crypt. A copy of the plaque here is in the floor of the cathedral nave above, to the right of the entrance. It says simply, "Here lies Filippo Brunelleschi, the great Florentine genius." And he certainly was that. He invented one-point perspective. He was almost Ghiberti's equal in bronze work. He did wood sculpture that Donatello thought better than his own. He put up what was called the first Renaissance building, and he erected the largest dome built in 1,000 years. This is an anonymous portrait now of Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici, which is in the Bargello. Although legends about early members of the Medici family survive, going back to one Averardo, said to have been a friend of Charlemagne, the first real documentable members of the family lived in the 13th century, and in the 14th, a distant ancestor and relative of Giovanni, Salvastro de' Medici, supported the unsuccessful rebellion of the Ciompi, the lowest class of wool workers. This did short-term harm to the family, but it also served to identify them with the interests of the Florentine people at large, rather than with the aristocracy. The reputation the Medici enjoyed for being the champions of the ordinary man held up until nearly the end of the 15th century, and was not even lessened by their phenomenally growing wealth. Giovanni de' Bicci here himself held office as one of the priors 4 times and was Gonfaloniere, or mayor, in 1421. This is the way Piazza Repubblica in Florence looks today. In the 19th century, this neighborhood was subjected to radical urban renewal, much lamented by modern aesthetes who don't have to live in the charming, noxious, vermin-infested alleys that once occupied it. In Giovanni's day, the residence of the Medici stood to the right where the big building is there, and actually fronted on Piazza del Duomo, where you can see Giotto's Campanile in the distance on the other side of that building. Giovanni himself is not famous as an art patron and friend of artists, but he may have been one of the judges in the Baptistry Door Contest. He is said to have owned 3 books. This is a posthumous portrait of his son, Cosimo, by Pontormo, but it's consistent with other surviving likenesses, some of which we'll see. Cosimo was already 40 at the time of his father's death in 1429, and already had had plenty of time then to learn about things like mergers and acquisitions, venture capital, and so on. He inherited a lot of money from Giovanni, but within a few years, thanks to acumen and good luck, his motto was Col nome di Dio e Bonaventura, in the name of God and good luck. He had begun to increase the family wealth dramatically. In his old age, he would estimate that he had spent $80 million in gold on the arts alone, and regretted that he hadn't spent more. His grandson Lorenzo is really much more well known, but he was nowhere near the art patron that Cosimo was. Neither Cosimo nor Lorenzo, it should be pointed out, held any high office in Florence, let alone that of prince or duke, which fact was sometimes held against members of the family by people like snobby French aristocrats, but the Medici were trusted by the people to make the right decisions. Their position was sort of like that of Pericles in 5th century Athens. Cosimo's one big gaffe came soon after he took over as head of the family, when he supported the war against Lucca that turned into a fiasco that also involved Brunelleschi. The latter tried to dam the Arno to flood the enemy city and wound up drowning a good part of the Florentine army instead. And led by the Albizzi, Cosimo's opponents were able to have him banished from the city for 10 years, although supporters of Cosimo and the Medici overthrew the Albizzi and he was able to return in just a few months. This is the Palazzo Medici in Florence now, which was begun for Cosimo as a new residence in 1444. The architect was Michelozzo, whom we've already heard about in connection with San Marco. I mentioned then that he had gone into exile with Cosimo, who was his good friend, and this probably explains also why he got this job, although Brunelleschi himself did submit a plan for it. Brunelleschi, however, as we've seen, did get the job rebuilding San Lorenzo, the Medici family church just behind you in this view, when Giovanni de' Bici was still the head of the family in the 1420s. But Brunelleschi's plans for the family palazzo were thought by Cosimo to be too ostentatious. What Michelozzo built here might look ostentatious also compared to your house, but it was no larger or more ostentatious than those of many other important Florentine families. Cosimo was, relatively speaking, a modest man and not given to pompous public display, preferring, in fact, to stay out of the public eye as much as possible. He didn't want public display to reflect the true state of his wealth. The more wealthy a man is, the saying goes, the more others think they can rob him with impunity. As a work of architecture, it still has something of the urban fortress look of other earlier palazzi in Florence, but compared to what was being built at this time in the north, it is strikingly modern, and except for the rusticated ground floor and the overhanging cornice at the top maybe, it would not look much out of place on Main Street or Wall Street today. Here you can see the Palais Jaucourt in Bourges, which was contemporary with it, begun just about the same time exactly, and which would certainly look out of place on Wall Street. This is still all Gothic pinnacles and filigree that won't go out of style in France for another 50 years. This is the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici now. Vasari says it was the first house built primarily for the comfort of the occupant, which can hardly be true, but I think what he means at least is that it was meant to be a house first and not a fortress. Today it's the city hall. Cosimo had several important artists work on the decoration of the palazzo, but unfortunately most of what was done in the 15th century has either been moved, like Donatello's Bronze David, which we've seen, and Uccello's Battle of San Romano, which we will see shortly, or else destroyed. The one exception is the series of frescoes by Benozzo Gozzoli in the chapel here. And you can see that chapel now. Gozzoli was an assistant to Fra Angelico and accompanied him to Rome on his first trip, but even though his subject here is a nominally religious one, the Procession of the Magi, his treatment of it is wholly secular, and it really has more in common with Gentile da Fabriano's altarpiece we saw at the outset today than it does with anything by Fra Angelico. The Magi wind here around from the entrance around the chapel clockwise to approach the Virgin and Child at the altar. I mentioned earlier that the Medici like to identify themselves with the Magi, so this is, even if an essentially secular treatment, an appropriate subject for the chapel in their palazzo. The walls were painted by Benozzo in 1459, but his work was to a considerable degree inspired by the Council of Florence in 1439. In that year, Florence and Cosimo's friend Eugenius IV, the Pope, hosted an attempt to heal the breach between the Roman and Eastern churches, and to that end all sorts of luminaries visited the city, including Joseph, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Eastern Emperor John VIII, anxious to get support against the Turks. The breach wasn't closed, Roman Catholic help wasn't sent, and by the time this picture was painted, Constantinople had fallen. Still, the Council of 1439 did produce enough splendid ceremonies, attended by people in fine clothes, that the Florentines, and not least Benozzo, still remembered it all 20 years later. Eugenius IV has never been identified among the people in the procession, but the Emperor John and apparently Cosimo have been identified, along with several other eminent people, as we'll see in some close-ups. There is some controversy, however, about some of the identifications. And while we look at these close-ups, we'll hear 3 Italian songs by Guillaume Dufay. When he was in Italy, he wrote in Italian. When he was in Flanders, he wrote in French, typically. In this detail, it's thought we see Cosimo at the left, his legitimate son Piero at the right, and his illegitimate son Carlo in between them. This is apparently Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo, although he would have been only 10 at the time, a fact ignored by most commentators. The bush behind him is said to be a laurel, which is, though thought to be a clue, Laurel, Lorenzo.
It is also true that the Medici coat of arms, the balls on the shield, are on the trappings of his horse.
He would be playing the role of the youngest Magus in the procession. This is thought by some to be his younger brother Giuliano, although again he was only 6 in 1459.
Some think the 2 boys identified here are actually the young Lorenzo and Giuliano. And as I suggested, a lot of attempts have been made not only to identify Medici family members, but other celebrities contemporary with them who might be pictured.
And this is the Eastern Emperor, John VIII from Constantinople, who returned home to be widely condemned for negotiating with the Pope. In this detail, we probably see on the left Sigismondo Malatesta, the famous Lord of Rimini, who was not in Florence in 1439, but who was there in 1459, the year this was painted, for a somewhat less famous conclave involving Pope Pius II's attempt to mount a crusade to get Constantinople back from Islam after it had fallen after John VIII's death in 1453, 4 years after his death. We'll hear a lot more about Sigismundo and his not always cordial relationship with Pope Pius II next week. The other fellow on the right is Galeazzo Maria Sforza, who was assassinated at the entrance to the Cathedral of Milan in 1476. And this is a self-portrait of Benozzo Gozzoli himself. Here's one of the many beautiful landscape details in the fresco, which again remind one of Gentili's earlier altarpiece we saw at the start today. Another detail. And another one. And another, no pure landscapes with out human subjects were painted in Italy in the 15th century, but obviously if there had been a market for them, people like Gozzoli could have done them. And here are the angels at the end of the procession overlooking the altar of the chapel. And this is the original painting for the altar by Fra Filippo Lippi. It's now in the Berlin State Museum. A bit of a foreshadowing of Leonardo's Virgin in the Rocks in this, in the way it's lit. Ahead of its time, really, in that way. Of all the artists in the 15th century, probably no one was more fascinated by geometrical perspective than Paolo Uccello. This is a drawing of a vase he made, which can just illustrate this point. Vasari says that he would stay up all night working on things like this, and when his wife would try to get him to come to bed, he would respond, "Ah, wife, perspective is a sweeter mistress than any woman." In 1436, he painted the fresco we saw earlier, which honors John Hawkwood in the Cathedral of Florence. And in the 1430s, he also painted the poorly preserved but highly regarded frescoes in the so-called Green Cloister of Santa Maria Novella. His most famous work, however, is the series of tempera on wood battle pictures he did for what was known as Lorenzo's Room in the Palazzo Medici. None of these pictures are still there, but they do survive in the London National Gallery, the Louvre, and the Uffizi. There is some evidence that these pictures were actually confiscated by Lorenzo from the fellow who actually commissioned them from Uccello, but in any case, the Medici did own them for a long time. This one is in the London National Gallery now. The paintings illustrate the Battle of San Romano, which took place in 1432. The Sienese condottiere, Bernardo della Ciarda, led a raid near Florence, and the Florentine soldier Niccolo da Tolentino chased him back to the south, but was ambushed himself by the Sienese at San Romano. Tolentino is the fellow with the extravagant red turban on here. He was rescued from his plight by another Florentine, Micheletto da Cotignola. I think this should be regarded as the first completely secular work by one of the great 15th century Florentine artists. It should also be noticed that we do not have here the usual serenity of the 15th century Renaissance, but as I've said, the goal was to make the subject as serene as possible, consistent with the subject itself, and serene battle is pretty much just an oxymoron. We're going to see some more details from these pictures now, and in them you'll notice that, although Uccello is a master of the theory of geometrical perspective, his landscapes are completely unconvincing. He couldn't, or at least didn't, transfer his theoretical knowledge to this kind of subject. And while we see these pictures, we'll hear a song by Josquin des Prez called Scaramella. This is a soldier's song that was arranged in various ways by at least half a dozen composers in the 15th century, the most important of whom was Josquin des Prez, who will in fact become the most important composer of the late 15th and early 16th centuries in Italy, although like Dufay, he was born in Flanders. Scaramella, here you see Micheletto, who arrived in time to rescue Tolentino from the Sienese ambush. More of the battle. One critic says that the horses look like they've escaped from a merry-go-round, and I think the knights do look a little like metal robots, but something of the generally faceless brutality of battle is certainly conveyed in this. Here you can see Bernardo della Ciarda being knocked off his horse at the climax of the fight. Notice the animals in the background, which are supposed to be running but look more like they're flying. It's like the battle has a kind of painted backdrop behind it rather than an actual landscape. Next to Cello's portrait of Hawkwood in the cathedral is Andrea del Castagno's painted monument honoring Tolentino for his service to the Florentine Republic on this and other occasions. And that's no merry-go-round horse. It looks like a cross between a horse and a crocodile. Tolentino apparently never lost his turban, even in the heat of battle. The format used here by del Castagno is the same as that used by Uccello for Hawkwood. Notice that the horse and its pedestal, as in Uccello's picture, are represented as though seen from two different vantage points, creating the illusion that the horse is standing on the very edge of the pedestal. Horse fanciers are also quick to point out that horses don't raise both feet on one side at the same time. Del Castagno himself was known as the Hangman because at one time he had the job painting the ephemeral portraits of executed enemies of the Republic, which were on the walls of the Bargello, where they were subjected to the random abuse of good citizens in the weather. Botticelli, of all people, later had the job, which did pay well, of painting the portraits of these executed criminals, and Leonardo da Vinci also wanted it, but didn't get it. One of the few pieces of ephemeral art to survive from the 15th century is this shield with David painted on it by del Castagno in 1439. It must, I think, have been carried by someone in one of the parades or celebrations carried on in connection with the Council of Florence in that year, which inspired Gozzoli's frescoes we saw a bit ago. This is a very different treatment than David was given by Donatello. Goliath's head is at David's feet, but you almost don't notice it here because David is depicted at the moment of the confrontation, not just posing with his trophy. This is perhaps a more important exception to the rule that the 15th century Renaissance is serene than Uccello's battle pictures, because the famous Davids before Michelangelo's, in particular Donatello's, which we've seen, in Verrocchio's, which we'll eventually see, are serene or at least relaxed. This fellow has something of the Baroque about him. He's all full of fighting energy and wind-blown theater. Del Castagno died in his 30s and had a reputation for getting into trouble. Vasari says he actually murdered the Venetian painter Domenico Veneziano, whom Cosimo had invited to Florence because the fellow wouldn't teach him how to paint with oil, something the Venetians mastered, or at least practiced, long before the medium became popular in Florence. In fact, Domenico outlived del Castagno, so Vasari was wrong about this. But as I said, he did have a bad reputation. This is one of the most important paintings by Domenico Veneziano now, the Santa Lucia altarpiece of 1445 and today in the Uffizi Gallery. This makes an interesting contrast to del Castagno's David because this is typical 15th century Renaissance serenity. It's also not in oil, but I'm not sure anything that survives by him is in fact in oil, which is another reason to question Vasari's account of his relationship with Andrea del Castagno. This is tempera, like almost all Florentine panel paintings until near the end of the century. This is sometimes considered to be the first great example of the Sacra Conversazione format, the Madonna and Child with Saints, but as we've seen, Fra Angelico used this arrangement 25 years earlier. This is a still more informal treatment of the Virgin, though. She's put here into a kind of open-air gazebo. There are no angels present. And Domenico has made a very interesting attempt to depict the contrast between the part of the little building which is in sunlight and that which is in the shade. It's a little hard to see this, but there's a pretty clear line of demarcation running diagonally across the picture just to the left of the Virgin. Masaccio had painted shadows of a sort in the Brancacci Chapel, but they're basically just gray spots. The treatment here is much more sophisticated. Domenico knows, like the Impressionists, that shadows have color. Things don't just turn gray when we put them in the shade. Just as the dramatic quality of Del Castagno's David suggests the Baroque, so does this rudimentary interest in the effects of light. Most Italian Renaissance pictures were painted as though the subjects were uniformly lit from all sides. Light doesn't play a part in the effect the pictures make. We saw one picture that can count as an exception to this rule in Fra Filippo Lippi's Madonna for the Palazzo Medici Chapel, but Leonardo will really be the first not only to do all his panel painting in oil, but to really try to consistently exploit the possibilities of light. St. Francis and John the Baptist, pointing at the Savior, are on the left here, and on the right are St. Zenobius, the first Bishop of Florence, and Santa Lucia, after whom the altarpiece is named. She carries her eyeballs on that plate. She was blinded during her martyrdom. This is the work of Fra Filippo Lippi now, the Coronation of the Virgin in the Uffizi Gallery. This is one of his earliest surviving pictures and was painted in the early 1440s. It's a traditional subject, but Fra Filippo will become famous in part for taking the humanization of the Virgin to the point at which she's hardly distinguishable from any other Florentine mother. This is said to be the picture which first attracted the attention of Cosimo to Filippo's work, and this resulted in his spending quite a bit of time in the Palazzo Medici, for the chapel of which, remember, he painted the Virgin and Child, which we saw earlier at the end of the Gozzoli Procession of the Magi. It's also supposed to be the picture that inspired Browning's poem about Fra Filippo, but Browning thought Filippo was the fellow at the lower right in black with the inscription in front of him that reads, in effect, "I made this." It's now thought that this is actually a picture of the fellow who paid for it, however, and that Fra Filippo, who of course really made it in the most important sense, is the fellow at the lower left, in the monk's habit, resting his chin in his hand and looking out of the picture at us. You can see him a little better at the lower left in this close-up. Brother, or Fra Filippo, did not really become a monk by choice. He was abandoned at Santa Maria della Carmine at the age of 8 and presumably chose monasticism as a lesser evil than starvation. His skill in drawing was noticed, however, and when he was about 20, he was apparently allowed to assist Masaccio in some way in the Brancacci Chapel there. At the age of 26, he ran away from the monastery, something which was subject to being treated as a serious crime, but never was in his case. To some extent, this was probably due to the influence of Cosimo. One of the best-known parts of Vasari's biography of Fra Filippo and of Browning's poem about him tells the story of how Cosimo used to lock him in at night to keep him from chasing women and getting into trouble. He was clearly not cut out to be a monk. This is the Bartolini Madonna of about 1450 by Fra Filippo in the Pitti Palace. Here you can see the treatment of the Virgin for which he's famous. This looks more like a genre picture than a religious work, and it's only the most insubstantial of halos that keeps most observers from mistaking the Madonna for an ordinary portrait subject. The episodes in the background make reference to the story of her parents in the Golden Legend, about which we heard in connection with Giotto's pictures in the Arena Chapel. St. Anne has just given birth to the Virgin in the back at the left. In the 1450s, Fra Filippo was commissioned to paint frescoes in the Cathedral of Prato, which is a suburb of Florence, and while there he was also commissioned to paint pictures in the Church of Santa Margherita, which was part of a Carmelite convent that no longer exists. He asked for permission to have a novice who had caught his eye, one Lucrezia Buti, pose as the Madonna, and then he abducted her. It's thought, in fact, that we see Lucrezia playing the role of Salome in the fresco series on the life of John the Baptist, which Fra Filippo painted for the Prato Cathedral. This may be so, but this girl looks a lot like the Madonna we just saw also. I suppose it's possible that he was just so fascinated by Lucrezia because she looked like the conception of ideal femininity that he'd already created for himself. The abduction brought disgrace on the nunnery, and it is said that her father never smiled again, but she seems to have been entirely satisfied with Filippo, who, however, never married her, despite the fact that Cosimo continued to support him and even arranged a dispensation for him to leave the order so he could have married her if he'd wanted to. This Madonna in the Uffizi Gallery is probably Filippo Lippi's most well-known picture, and it's possible again that Lucrezia was his model. This was painted in 1455 after he had run away with her. This is the most portrait-like of all his Madonnas, and it did in fact have a big influence on secular portrait painters who will often put their subjects against a landscape like this. This is the way Mona Lisa is going to be painted. It's important to notice that neither this nor the Bartolini Madonna, as I mentioned earlier, was meant to serve as an altarpiece. This has a religious subject, but it was in all likelihood not meant to be the focus of worship in a chapel. It's an illustration, not an icon. Fra Filippo apparently wasn't very loyal to Lucrezia. Vasari says he was finally poisoned by a relative of some other woman with whom he'd been involved in Spoleto, where he died. Fra Filippo did, however, have an illegitimate son by Lucrezia, Filippino Lippi, and this is a portrait, a self-portrait by him, just really a sketch. He became an artist of considerable importance in his own right, and among other things, he finished the frescoes which Masaccio had begun at Santa Maria della Carmine, where his own father had been raised. This is Cafaggiolo, the country home near Florence which Michelozzo built for Cosimo, and Cosimo did like to spend a lot of time here, keeping out of the public eye as he thought prudent to do. Durand says he knew as much about fertilizer as philosophy, and he was considered an expert at pruning vines and fruit trees. His biographer Vespasiano says chess was the only game he played and that he could hold his own at it with Manuelino, considered the best chess player in Italy in the 15th century. In his old age, says Vespasiano, he read only serious works like the writings of St. Gregory, and when his wife complained that he spent too much time thinking about death and the hereafter, he answered, "Whenever we go to the country for just a few days, it takes you 2 weeks to get ready. I'm about to go somewhere for all eternity, and I just want to be prepared." She also complained that he would sit for long periods with his eyes closed, even at dinner with guests. His explanation to her was that he was again preparing for eternity by just trying to get used to the dark. Okay, that's where we'll wind up today. Next week we'll hear mostly about the non-Florentine Italian Renaissance in the 15th century and visit places like Urbino, Rimini, and Mantua and hear about artists like Piero della Francesca, Leon Battista Alberti, and Andrea Mantegna.